The moment I realized my daughter-in-law had been quietly pushing me out of my own family, it wasn't during an argument, and it wasn't because someone finally told me the truth. It happened on my 68th birthday, when I opened a photo album that was supposed to be a gift. I remember that morning clearly. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, catching the edges of the white curtains I had hung years ago with my late husband, Robert. I had spent the early hours baking a cinnamon coffee cake, not because I expected a big celebration, but because old habits are hard to break. Birthdays had always mattered in our family. Even after Robert passed away 4 years earlier, I still believed family milestones should bring people together. By noon, my son Ethan arrived with his wife Megan and my 2 grandchildren, Emma and Noah. The house filled with familiar voices, laughter, and the sound of shoes crossing hardwood floors. For a while, everything seemed normal. Megan carried in a bakery box and smiled warmly. Ethan hugged me and wished me a happy birthday. The children handed me a card covered in colorful drawings. Looking back, I can admit that I felt happy, maybe even grateful. There are moments when loneliness convinces you to lower your expectations, and any attention feels like a blessing. After lunch, Emma disappeared into the living room and returned carrying a large gift bag decorated with silver ribbons. "This is from all of us, Grandma," she said proudly. I smiled and pulled out a beautifully bound photo album. The cover read, "Family Memories." My heart softened immediately. I settled into my favorite armchair and began turning the pages. At first, I admired the photographs. Beach vacations, holiday dinners, birthday parties, school events, smiling faces, happy moments. Then I noticed something strange. I turned another page, then another, then 5 more. My smile faded. I wasn't in any of them. I kept flipping. Summer barbecues, Thanksgiving gatherings, Christmas mornings, weekend trips to the lake, family game nights. More photographs, more memories. Still no sign of me. A strange feeling settled in my chest. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was confusion. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe these were events I couldn't attend. Maybe the pictures had been selected randomly. But as I continued turning pages, the pattern became impossible to ignore. There were hundreds of photographs spanning several years. Ethan, Megan, Emma, Noah, friends, neighbors, even distant relatives. Everyone appeared again and again. Everyone except me. I glanced up from the album. Megan was chatting comfortably with Ethan in the kitchen. The children were playing with the family dog near the fireplace. No one seemed nervous. No one seemed aware that my hands had gone completely still. Then Emma walked over and pointed to a picture of herself standing beside a giant sandcastle. "That was my favorite trip," she said. "We were sad you didn't want to come." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" I asked gently. She shrugged. "Mom always said you didn't like coming to family things anymore." Her words were innocent, casual, spoken without any intention of causing harm. But they landed harder than anything I had heard all day. I looked back down at the album resting in my lap. For the first time, I wasn't seeing photographs. I was seeing evidence. And deep inside, a question began to form. If I had never chosen to stay away, then who had convinced my family that I did? I did not ask Emma any more questions that afternoon. She was only 10 years old, and whatever she believed had come from someone she trusted. I simply smiled, kissed the top of her head, and told her the photograph was beautiful. But inside, something had shifted. The rest of the birthday celebration passed in a blur. I laughed when I was supposed to laugh. I thanked everyone for the gifts. I cut slices of cake and poured coffee into familiar mugs. From the outside, I looked exactly like the same woman who had started the day. Inside, however, I could not stop thinking about those words. "We thought you did not want to come." After everyone left, the house became quiet again. The silence felt different than usual, heavier. I carried the photo album into the living room and placed it on the coffee table. Then I sat down and began turning through the pages again, slowly this time, carefully, looking beyond the smiling faces, looking for dates, locations, clues. There was a photograph from a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier. I remembered that holiday. I had spent it alone. Megan had called 3 days before and explained that Ethan was feeling overwhelmed and wanted a quiet celebration with just the children. I had believed her. Yet the photograph showed nearly 20 people gathered around a long dining table. Friends, cousins, neighbors. It was not a small gathering at all. A few pages later, I found pictures from Noah's 7th birthday party. I remembered that day too. Megan had texted me that Noah was feeling sick and that the party had been postponed. Looking at the photograph, I could see balloons, decorations, and a giant birthday cake. The date stamp in the corner matched the exact day I had stayed home. I closed the album for a moment and stared out the window. The evening sun was fading behind the trees. For years, I had accepted every explanation, every scheduling conflict, every last-minute change, every apology. I had never wanted to be the difficult mother-in-law. I had never wanted Ethan to feel caught between his wife and his mother. So I stayed quiet. I trusted. I adjusted. I convinced myself that families changed and that perhaps I simply needed to adapt. But now the memories began lining up in my mind like puzzle pieces finding their places. Christmas dinners I had supposedly declined. Weekend trips I had never heard about. School events where I was told there was limited seating. One by one, they resurfaced. Around 9 o'clock that night, my phone rang. It was my sister, Patricia. She called every year on my birthday. After we talked for a few minutes, she asked a simple question. Did you enjoy the family gathering at the lake last month? I sat up straight. What lake gathering? There was a brief pause. The one Ethan posted about. Everyone looked like they were having a wonderful time. My stomach tightened. I was never invited. Patricia fell silent. Then she quietly said something that stayed with me. Loretta, I did not want to interfere, but this is not the first time I have heard that. After we hung up, I remained in my chair for a long time. The house was dark except for a small lamp beside me. The album still rested on the table. The photographs no longer looked like family memories. They looked like records. Evidence of moments I should have shared, but somehow missed. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had avoided for years. Maybe these exclusions were not accidents. Maybe someone had been carefully shaping the story of who I was. And if that was true, I needed to find out why. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had come in short stretches, interrupted by memories I had not examined in years. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table while the sun slowly brightened the backyard. The photo album remained exactly where I had left it. For a long time, I simply stared at it. Then I opened a drawer and pulled out an old planner. I had always been organized. Birthdays, appointments, school events, family gatherings. Everything went into my calendar. At the time, it had seemed like a simple habit. That morning, it became something else. I began comparing my notes to the memories that had resurfaced the night before. Thanksgiving 2 years ago. I had written, family keeping it small this year. Christmas the year before that. Megan said seating was limited at her sister's house. Noah's birthday. Postponed due to illness. One by one, I reviewed them. Each explanation had sounded reasonable at the time. Each one had given me a reason not to ask questions. Around noon, I drove to the grocery store. It was a normal errand, something I had done hundreds of times before. As I walked through the produce section, I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw Linda Crawford, an old family friend I had known for nearly 20 years. We chatted for a few minutes about retirement, grandchildren, and the unusually warm spring weather. Then she smiled and said something that caught me off guard. I was sorry to miss you at Emma's school awards ceremony last month. I blinked. What awards ceremony? Her smile faded. The one at the middle school. Emma received recognition for academic excellence. Ethan looked very proud. I felt a strange hollowness settle in my stomach. I did not know there was a ceremony. Linda looked genuinely confused. Oh, I assumed you could not attend. Megan mentioned you were busy. There it was again. Another event. Another explanation. Another occasion everyone seemed to believe I had chosen to miss. I finished my shopping and drove home in silence. By then, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The issue was no longer a single birthday party or a missing invitation. It was years. Years of small absences. Years of stories being told on my behalf. That evening, I opened my laptop and logged into social media. Normally, I spent very little time there. But now I searched through old photographs and public posts. The deeper I looked, the more I found. A family picnic at a state park. A holiday brunch. Emma's dance recital. A neighborhood barbecue. Event after event appeared on the screen. In many of the photographs, I recognized people who often asked why they never saw me anymore. At the time, I had assumed they were simply being polite. Now I wondered what they had been told. As I continued scrolling, I noticed something else. The captions were remarkably similar. Family time. Everyone together. So grateful the whole family could make it. The whole family. I stared at those words for a long moment. Then I closed the laptop. The room felt unusually quiet. Outside, the first porch lights along the street were beginning to glow. For years, I had blamed distance, busy schedules, changing priorities, and the natural drift that comes with age. But a different possibility was taking shape now. Someone had not merely excluded me from important moments. Someone had carefully created the impression that I had excluded myself. And the more I thought about it, the harder it became to ignore one uncomfortable question. If Megan had spent years shaping that narrative, what else had she been saying when I was not there to hear it? Over the next few days, I stopped looking for dramatic answers and started paying attention to small details. If there was one thing I had learned during nearly 7 decades of life, it was that the truth rarely arrived all at once. It revealed itself quietly, piece by piece, one ordinary moment at a time. I began revisiting conversations I had almost forgotten. A comment here, a canceled plan there. Things that had seemed insignificant when they happened. One memory surfaced more clearly than the others. 3 years earlier, I had invited Ethan and his family to dinner on a Saturday evening. I spent the entire day preparing. I made Ethan's favorite pot roast, baked homemade rolls, and even bought a pie from the bakery he loved as a child. A few hours before they were supposed to arrive, Megan called. She sounded apologetic. She explained that Noah had developed a headache and they needed to stay home. Of course I understood. Children get sick. Families adjust. That was life. But now I remembered something else. The following week, one of my neighbors had casually mentioned seeing Ethan and Megan at an outdoor concert that same evening. At the time, I dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Now I was not so sure. Another memory followed. Emma's elementary school play. I had asked several times about the date because I wanted to be there. Megan eventually told me the school was limiting attendance due to space restrictions. Months later, I found a photograph online showing dozens of parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and family friends filling the auditorium. I was the only grandparent missing. Back then, I blamed bad timing. Now I wondered whether I had been blaming the wrong thing. One afternoon, I sat in my den and pulled out an old storage box filled with birthday cards, Christmas letters, and family keepsakes. It was something I often did when I missed Robert. Sorting through old memories always made me feel closer to him. As I worked through the box, I noticed something unusual. Several cards from Emma and Noah seemed strangely formal. The messages were sweet, but the wording felt distant, almost scripted. One card caught my attention. Emma had written, "We hope you are feeling better and that maybe next year you will want to come." I stared at the sentence for a long moment. Feeling better? I had not been sick. Want to come? Come to what? There was no explanation. Just a child's assumption that I had chosen not to attend something important. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Suddenly, I began seeing the situation through the eyes of my grandchildren. If they had been told repeatedly that grandma preferred staying home, they would eventually believe it. If they heard often enough that grandma declined invitations, they would stop expecting her to appear. A story repeated often becomes accepted as truth, especially for children. That realization hurt more than the missed events themselves. I could tolerate being excluded. What troubled me was the possibility that Emma and Noah had been quietly taught to see me as someone who did not care enough to show up. Later that evening, I opened my phone and looked through old text messages. Most conversations were ordinary. Family schedules, holiday greetings, quick updates. Then I noticed a pattern. Whenever plans involved the larger family, information almost always came through Megan. Rarely through Ethan, rarely through anyone else. She had become the gatekeeper of communication without my ever realizing it. And for the first time, a troubling possibility entered my mind. What if the invitations had not disappeared by accident? What if the story everyone believed about me had been carefully written by someone who benefited from keeping me on the outside? Once I noticed the pattern, I could not stop seeing it. Every day seemed to uncover another thread connected to the same invisible web. Still, I resisted jumping to conclusions. I wanted facts, not assumptions. I wanted certainty before I allowed myself to believe that someone had deliberately changed the way my family saw me. A week after my birthday, I received an unexpected phone call from Carol Mitchell, a woman I had known through church for nearly 15 years. We had not spoken recently, but she called to ask how I was doing. During our conversation, she mentioned a family picnic that had taken place the previous summer. I remembered seeing photographs online from that gathering. Carol laughed softly and said, "I was surprised you left so early. We barely had a chance to talk." I felt my breath catch. "Carol, I was not there." There was silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Megan told everyone you stopped by for a little while, but needed to leave." I closed my eyes. Another story. Another version of events that had never happened. After we ended the call, I sat alone in my kitchen for nearly an hour. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. What unsettled me most was not the lie itself. It was how casually it had been told. Someone had been creating explanations for my absence long before anyone had reason to ask questions. Later that afternoon, I decided to do something I had avoided for years. I searched through old emails. Most were routine. Holiday greetings, school fundraisers, community announcements. Then I found an email chain from 18 months earlier about a family reunion. The original message had been sent by Ethan's cousin. Everyone in the family had been included. Everyone except me. Yet farther down in the conversation, I found a reply from Megan thanking everyone and mentioning that I had chosen not to attend because I preferred quiet weekends at home. I stared at the screen. No one had ever asked me. No invitation had ever arrived. Yet there it was in writing. A complete explanation presented as fact. My hands remained steady, but inside I felt a growing sadness. Not anger. Not yet. Sadness. Because the more evidence I found, the more I realized how many opportunities had quietly disappeared from my life. Family memories, conversations, milestones, shared moments with my grandchildren. None of those could be replaced. That evening, I opened a small notebook and began writing down dates, events, conversations, names. I was not building a case against anyone. At least that was not how I thought of it. I was rebuilding a timeline, trying to understand how the distance between me and my family had grown so large without my noticing. By the end of the week, several pages were filled. Looking at them together revealed something important. The exclusions became more frequent after Robert passed away. Before that, there had been occasional misunderstandings. After his death, they became a pattern. It was as though the one person who naturally connected everyone together had disappeared, leaving space for someone else to control the flow of information. I closed the notebook and looked out the window. Across the street, a family was unloading groceries while children chased each other through the yard. The scene looked ordinary, peaceful, the kind of moment people rarely appreciate until it is gone. I thought about Emma and Noah. I thought about Ethan. Most of all, I thought about the version of me they seemed to believe existed. A woman who constantly declined invitations. A woman who preferred being alone. A woman who did not make an effort to be part of the family. The heartbreaking part was that none of it was true. And somewhere beneath all the confusion, one realization was becoming impossible to ignore. If Megan had spent years shaping that false image, then eventually I would need to understand exactly why. 2 weeks after my birthday, the answer arrived from a place I never expected. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Emma was spending the day with me while Ethan and Megan attended a community event. We baked chocolate chip cookies together, worked on a puzzle in the dining room, and talked about school. It was one of those ordinary afternoons that become precious as grandchildren grow older and busier. Around 3 o'clock, Emma wandered into the living room while I cleaned up the kitchen. A few minutes later, she called my name. There was excitement in her voice. When I walked in, she was standing beside an old bookshelf. In her hands was a framed photograph taken years earlier at a county fair. It showed Ethan, Robert, Emma, Noah, and me smiling beside a giant pumpkin display. "I love this picture," Emma said. "Mom does not keep many pictures of you at our house." I paused. "Really?" She nodded. "Most of the family pictures are just us." Her answer was simple, honest. The kind of observation only a child would make without realizing its significance. Then she said something else. Something that stayed with me long after she left that evening. "Mom always says you like being by yourself." I felt a familiar ache settle in my chest. Not because of the statement itself, but because of how naturally she said it. Like a fact. Like something she had heard many times. I sat beside her on the couch. "Do you think that is true?" I asked gently. Emma looked surprised. "I do not know. You seem happy when we visit." I smiled. "I am always happy when you visit." She smiled back and returned to her puzzle. But my thoughts remained fixed on that conversation. Children rarely invent narratives like that on their own. They absorb them, repeat them, eventually believe them. Later that night, after Emma had gone home, I found myself looking through old family photographs again. This time, I paid attention to the years before Robert passed away. In almost every picture, he stood in the center of the family. He organized gatherings, made phone calls, remembered birthdays, followed up on invitations. If someone felt left out, Robert noticed immediately. For decades, he had been the bridge connecting everyone together. When he died, that bridge disappeared, and gradually, someone else stepped into the space he left behind. The more I thought about it, the more another possibility emerged. Perhaps Ethan had never realized what was happening. Throughout my search, I had found evidence of altered invitations, false explanations, and carefully constructed stories. But I had never found proof that Ethan created any of them. In fact, many signs pointed the other way. He seemed to believe the same narrative everyone else believed. That I preferred distance. That I declined invitations. That I chose not to participate. The realization changed something inside me. For the first time, I stopped viewing the situation as a conflict between myself and my entire family. Instead, it began to look like something far more complicated. A misunderstanding deliberately maintained over many years. A story repeated often enough that even good people accepted it as truth. I looked at the notebook containing my timeline. The pages were now filled with dates, emails, conversations, and memories. The evidence was growing. So was my certainty. But another question remained unanswered. If Megan had worked this hard to keep me on the outside, what was she protecting on the inside? The answer began to reveal itself in the most unexpected way. About a week later, I decided to clean out a closet in the guest bedroom. It was something I had postponed for years. Boxes had accumulated there after Robert passed away, and every time I opened the door, I promised myself I would sort through them another day. That afternoon, I finally did. Most of the boxes contained ordinary things. Old tax records, holiday decorations, photo albums. Then I found a small cardboard container tucked behind a stack of blankets. It looked familiar, but I could not immediately remember what it contained. When I opened it, I froze. Inside were dozens of envelopes. Some had been opened, others had not. Many were addressed to me. I sat down on the floor and began sorting through them. Several were birthday cards from Emma and Noah. Others were invitations to school events, family gatherings, and community celebrations. One envelope contained a handwritten note from Ethan's cousin inviting me to the family reunion I had supposedly declined. The postmark showed it had been mailed nearly 2 years earlier. Another invitation was for Emma's middle school awards ceremony. Another was for a neighborhood holiday party. As I examined them more closely, a troubling pattern emerged. None of these items had ever reached me. Somehow, they had ended up in a forgotten box instead. My heart pounded as I continued looking. Then I noticed something even stranger. Several envelopes had my name written in one handwriting, but additional notes had been added in another. On one invitation, someone had written, "Loretta cannot make it." On another, "She already has plans." The words felt oddly familiar. I had seen those same explanations repeated countless times over the years. I carefully placed everything on the dining room table and began arranging the items by date. The timeline I had been building suddenly expanded. What had once been suspicions now looked increasingly like evidence. Yet I still struggled with one question. How had these invitations ended up here? I lived alone. No one collected my mail except me. The only people who occasionally helped organize things around the house were Ethan and Megan, especially during the difficult months after Robert's passing. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the collection spread before me. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, yet inside my home, a completely different reality was taking shape. For years, I had assumed life simply moved on without me. I thought distance, age, and changing priorities explained everything. Now I was looking at proof that opportunities to stay connected had existed all along. Someone had simply made sure they never reached me. More than once, I found myself hoping there was an innocent explanation, a misunderstanding, a series of mistakes, anything other than what the evidence suggested. But every new discovery pointed in the same direction. Later that evening, I placed the invitations, cards, and notes into protective folders. I was no longer searching for answers. I was preserving them. Because deep down, I sensed that sooner or later, these forgotten pieces of paper would force a conversation that could no longer be avoided. And when that day arrived, The truth would be much harder for anyone to explain away. For several days, I did nothing. At least that was how it appeared from the outside. I continued my normal routines. I watered the flowers on the front porch. I attended church on Sunday. I met friends for coffee. I answered phone calls and text messages with the same calm voice I had always used. But privately, I was preparing for something important. The following month, I decided to host a family gathering at my house. There was no special occasion attached to it. No birthday. No holiday. I simply told everyone that I missed spending time together and wanted to enjoy an afternoon with the people I loved. To my surprise, everyone agreed to come. Ethan sounded pleased when I called. Emma and Noah were excited about seeing the old backyard swing Robert had built years earlier. Even Megan seemed cheerful when she replied to my invitation. During the weeks leading up to the gathering, I organized everything carefully. The dining table was extended to its full length. Fresh flowers sat in the center. Family photographs lined a display shelf in the living room. I prepared recipes that had been passed down through generations. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary family reunion. In reality, it was something else entirely. The night before the gathering, I placed several folders on my desk. Inside were copies of invitations that never reached me, emails I had never seen, notes written on envelopes, and photographs connected to events I had supposedly declined. I reviewed everything one final time. Then I closed the folders and went to bed. The next afternoon, family members began arriving. Laughter filled the house. Children ran through the yard. Conversations drifted from room to room. For a while, I simply observed. Watching everyone together reminded me why I had spent so much time searching for the truth in the first place. None of this had ever been about revenge. It had always been about belonging. After lunch, I stood and thanked everyone for coming. Then I asked if they would mind joining me in the living room for a few minutes. The room gradually grew quiet. Ethan sat beside Megan on the couch. Emma and Noah settled onto the rug. Several relatives found seats wherever they could. I carried the first folder into the room and placed it on the coffee table. "There is something I would like to share," I said. My voice remained calm. "Steady." No one appeared concerned. At least not yet. I began with the photo album from my birthday. Then I showed the invitations that never arrived. The emails. The notes. The dates. One by one, I laid them out. I did not accuse anyone. I did not raise my voice. I simply explained what I had discovered. As the timeline unfolded, expressions around the room began to change. Confusion appeared first, then surprise, then something deeper. Ethan leaned forward and picked up one of the documents. His eyes moved slowly across the page. He read it again. Then he looked at another. The room remained completely silent. For years, everyone had accepted a story about me. A story that said I preferred distance. A story that explained every absence and every missed gathering. But now that story was sitting on the coffee table beside undeniable evidence. And for the first time, I could see people beginning to question everything they thought they knew. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence felt different from any silence I had experienced before. It was not uncomfortable. It was the sound of people reconsidering something they had believed for years. Ethan continued turning through the documents. I watched his expression change as he compared dates, emails, and handwritten notes. Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Others stared quietly at the papers spread across the table. Finally, Ethan looked up. "Mom," he said slowly, "I do not understand this." His voice was not defensive. It was confused. Genuinely confused. I nodded. Neither did I at first. I reached for one of the folders and handed him a copy of the reunion invitation I had never received. Then I showed him the email where it was explained that I had declined. One by one, the missing pieces began connecting. The school ceremony, the holiday gathering, the family picnic, the birthday parties. The same pattern appeared again and again. Ethan rubbed his forehead and looked toward Megan. She remained unusually quiet. For years, I had imagined this moment might feel satisfying if it ever happened. It did not. It felt sad. Sad because so much time had been lost. Sad because misunderstandings had been allowed to grow into distance. Most of all, sad because none of us could recover the moments we had missed. Emma broke the silence first. "Grandma always wanted to come?" she asked. Her voice was small and uncertain. I smiled gently. "Always." She looked down at her hands. Noah did the same. Ethan stared at the documents for another long moment. Then he asked the question I had been asking myself for months. Why would anyone tell us otherwise? No one answered immediately. I did not answer either. The evidence spoke for itself. There was no need for accusations. No need for raised voices. The facts were already sitting in front of everyone. Eventually, several relatives began sharing their own memories. One remembered being told I was traveling. Another recalled hearing that I preferred staying home. Someone else mentioned being surprised that I never attended certain events. As each story emerged, the same pattern became impossible to ignore. The narrative about me had traveled farther than I realized. It had become accepted truth. Yet none of it was true. As the afternoon continued, something unexpected happened. The conversation stopped being about blame. Instead, it became about understanding, about reconnecting, about correcting years of assumptions. Emma moved from the floor and sat beside me on the couch. Noah followed a few minutes later. Ethan remained quiet for a long time. Then he reached across the coffee table and placed his hand over mine. It was a simple gesture, one I had not expected. "I am sorry," he said softly. Those two words carried more weight than any explanation could have. I squeezed his hand and nodded. Because the truth was, I had never wanted revenge. I had never wanted anyone punished. What I wanted was much simpler. I wanted my family to know who I really was. The gathering slowly returned to normal after that. Conversations resumed. The children went outside. People helped clear dishes from the dining room. Yet something had changed. Not dramatically, not instantly, but enough. As the sun began setting beyond the backyard, I stood by the kitchen window and watched my family together. For the first time in years, I did not feel like a guest observing someone else's life. I felt included, seen, remembered. The photo album that started everything still rested on a nearby table. Earlier, it had represented absence. Now it represented something else. A turning point. A reminder that the truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins with a single photograph, a single question, a single moment when you finally decide to look closer. And when I looked out at my family that evening, I realized something important. I had not recovered the years that were lost, but I had recovered something even more valuable. My place within the family I never stopped loving.